Walter Isaacson, thank you very much for coming on the program. I want to start with the controversy over Ukraine, just because it's topical, but also because it kind of raises many questions about Elon Musk's worldview. And I just wondered what the actual version of events was. Did he turn off the Starlink coverage over Crimea because he thought it would risk World War III, or did he just not switch it on because of that reason?
There had been a geofencing of the area around Crimea that he had put into place right sometime before the Ukrainians tried the sneak attack. And I was there that night listening to him as he was telling me about it. I got the impression he had turned it off right that night, but I later realized it had been a policy to geofence Crimea so Ukraine couldn't use Starlink to attack it. But the Ukrainians did not know that. And so that night they're thinking it's working and they're dealing with him and they want him to make sure it would work. And he says no. He reasserts the policy that they cannot use it to attack the Russian fleet in Sevastopol. And of course, he's created the only communication satellites that seem to work. You know, the Russians have knocked out all of the others. And that gave him an enormous amount of power to have this policy that it could not be used for offensive purposes in Crimea. I think afterwards, we were talking about it, he felt he almost had too much power, and he ends up making a deal with the U.S. government that he's going to sell a certain amount of military-grade Starlinks to the U.S. government so they get to make the decision of how it's used.
That was going to be my next question, because one of the things he could have done is immediately pick up the phone to the White House, to Jake Sullivan, and say, they're getting mad in Kiev that I've turned this thing off, or rather that it's not on for them, thwarting their attack. What should I be doing?
Right, he does talk to Jake Sullivan, he does talk to General Milley, and eventually SpaceX works out a deal where these type of satellites are used by the military of the U.S., and they get to make these decisions. I think that Musk felt, and you know, anybody can debate this if they want, if you have a sneak attack on the Russian fleet in Sevastopol, who knows what the consequences would have been? So he says to me, hey, how did I get into this war? I built this thing to do so people could watch movies and play video games. So I think even sometimes he's uncomfortable with some of the power he has.
Because that was my next question again. Does he seek that power, or is that power thrust up on him, and does it humble him when he realizes that he's got it?
Well, I don't think things humble him that much. But I think you've asked the larger question that's right, is how come he has that much power? And you got to ask also, how is it that the U.S. military, all of its contractors, all these other private companies can't make satellites that can withstand Russian hacking? How is it that NASA and the U.S. government can't make rockets anymore that send things into the orbit? How is it that GM and Ford got out of the business of electric cars and Musk made something that's more valuable than the next 9 car companies combined? What is it that gives him this power? And what has happened to us, you know, our society, that we're no longer able to make things like rockets that can go into orbit, and he can. So I think this power comes to him simply because he's the only person who's been able to build an internet in low Earth orbit, whereas everybody from Jeff Bezos to Viasat to others. If you look at U.S. military satellites, NASA can't launch them into orbit. They're too big. But SpaceX can. So he's the only person who can get U.S. military satellites into orbit. I think we have, as a society, have got to look at what's happened to us, that we've become so sclerotic that others can't do these things.
But in that very moment, when he can decide the success or the failure of this very important naval operation from the Ukrainians, what does he do? How does he respond? And hence my question about him perhaps being humbled in that moment.
He has an apocalyptic view of the world sometimes. He believes things can go mightily wrong. And he believes that a nuclear war can happen. World War III could happen. I don't know if he's right or wrong about that, but I know that he's always dramatic in the apocalyptic things that can happen. And that's what was going through his head.
Let's go back to his early childhood. How much of what he's doing now and how much of what he's achieved started, in the playground of his schools in South Africa, where he was clearly very badly bullied?
He was socially awkward, a scrawny kid, beaten up all the time, and that caused a lot of scars. But the main scars were the psychological ones caused by his father, who was a brilliant engineer, but also a very Jekyll and Hyde-like character who would go into dark moods. So after Elon gotten beaten up once and was in the hospital, almost unrecognizable, when he gets home, he has to stand in front of his father, who for more than an hour berates him and calls him stupid and takes the side of the person who's beaten him up. And so I do think that those demons are still dancing around in his head. And the little kid on the playground has become, a man-child now owning the world's biggest playground in some ways, which is Twitter or X.
So owning Twitter is owning the playground and basically conducting the play on his terms? Is that what that is about?
I do think that he had multiple motivations for buying Twitter. But when it really comes down to it, it was just impulsive. He's very impulsive at times. He didn't sort of think the whole thing through. He just knew that he loved being on Twitter, and he thought Twitter could get much better. It could have video. It could have a payment system. It could fulfill the vision that Musk had 20 years ago for a company he called X.com, which is now PayPal, which is not only a financial transaction service, but a financial service connected to a social media thing so that people could pay for content like this show or people could post videos. So I think that was his main driving force for buying Twitter.
I mean, the theme that runs throughout your book and therefore throughout his life is a certain playfulness. He escapes from the bullying at school by playing video games or by inventing stuff. Is that really is that where the genius comes from? Escape through invention?
There's multiple personalities of Elon Musk, just as there are of his father. And there are times when Elon Musk is playful. There's times when he's trolling, which is almost like, a sophomore's sense of humor stoned in a college dorm room. Joking about, I'm going to get into a cage match with Mark Zuckerberg. That was never going to happen, but it's part of his trolling, joking personality. But then he can turn very dark at times, and he can get very mean at times, and sometimes that's on Twitter too. He'll call a British cave diver a pedophile, or he will amplify some people from the fringes that he's now allowed on Twitter. So you can't say, what's Elon Musk's personality? You have to say they're different personalities at different times.
Did you like him? Do you like him?
Well, there were some Elon, that's such an anodyne word, and people keep asking that question. I say, there are Elon Musk that I liked and Elon Musk that I didn't. One of his girlfriends, Claire Boucher, known as Grimes, said you got to make sure you're with the right Elon. There's certain Elons that are inspiring and certain that are charming, charismatic, certain ones that, just are funny. But there are also times when, in a flash, he'll go into being a dark or conspiratorial or angry Elon. And boy, I didn't like those when I was around those Elons.
And could you believe all the different Elons you came across? Did you believe what those Elons told you?
It's interesting. Sometimes Musk would say certain things when he was in demon mode, just like his father, who has a Jekyll and Hyde personality. And he would say things in dark demon mode, sometimes really horrible things to people in front of him. And afterwards, when he snapped out of it, or a few hours later, I go back to him and I say, hey, what did you mean by that? Did you really mean it? Whatever. And he would almost have no recollection of what he said. It was almost as if he just switched from mode to mode.
Is there something scary about someone who, as you put it, goes into demon mode now and again, wielding as much power as he does?
Yeah, I do think so. I think especially when he gets into those dark modes, it's been particularly problematic for what used to be known as Twitter, where he'll amplify people in dark modes, and it becomes a problem where he creates an environment that advertisers don't want. One of the themes of my book is, how did he achieve so much? How did he do it? How come his rockets can go into orbit, boost things into orbit, and then land upright and be reused again, where no other company and no other country has been able to do that? We've had a society that now has more referees than it has innovators, that it has more regulators than it has people who can get stuff done. And I think Elon's too much on the one side, that he's too risk-taking. But I think in some ways that risk-taking has gotten him where he is. And we need probably a few fewer referees and a few more risk-takers if we're going to have more groups that can send satellites into orbit and land boosters upright. I think that we're not very good these days at manufacturing and building factories in the United States. And one of the things that he has done that's not quite as exciting as Starlink in Ukraine or whatever, is build factories and processes that can make not only an electric vehicle, but make 1 million of them at an affordable price. Not only can build Falcon 9 rockets and send up Starlink satellites, but send up thousands of them and churn them out. So I think one of the things in this book is about the secrets he has, the rules that he has, the algorithm he has for manufacturing. And that's part of the key to his success and why other companies haven't put up the same satellites or the same rockets that can re-land, that can be reused.
And yet, as we said before, not all people obsessed with process and engineering and technology veer into the sphere of politics or free speech. So on that front, he's got Twitter, he's got his playground, he prides himself, I'm assuming, as a First Amendment free speech advocate. And yet, if you look at what he's done, he's put Trump back onto Twitter. He launched Ron DeSantis' campaign on Twitter. He's allowed Tucker Carlson back onto Twitter. You could be forgiven for saying that he definitely slants in one direction.
I think he put his thumb on the scale when he bought Twitter towards the more populist, you could call it right, or it's hard to know how to describe some of these people. And he wanted to open the aperture to free speech. And you're right, there is a balance that needs to be struck between, yes, having a Donald Trump allowed to be back on Twitter, opening the aperture of free speech, and then on the other hand, making sure that the whole environment doesn't become so toxic and spewing of hate. And he has definitely opened up the aperture to more free speech, but at times he's hypocritical. He gets really mad when people use the platform to advocate a boycott of Twitter. So
or
he's
to criticize
not always consistent.
Exactly. And so, Trump was taken off Twitter after the 2020 election. Now he's back on Twitter. Are you worried that the next election coming up next year, with Trump back on Twitter, could be really chaotic, partly as a result of the decisions taken by Elon Musk?
Well, first of all, Trump isn't actually using Twitter, so we'll
he started.
see.
He's put his mugshot on Twitter.
But yes, I think I think Trump is a very disruptive, very, very chaotic person, and I think he would be bad for democracy for him to win. But I think it's a tough call about whether or not you're going to serve democracy by banning people running for president from Twitter, especially because you think they're too chaotic. I'm not going to pronounce on that right now, although, if you ask me personally, and I had my own little social network I was curating, I'd be a little bit more careful in the curation. I would be, but I don't own Twitter.
Okay, so you won't like this question either. Is Elon Musk good for American democracy in its current state?
I don't think Twitter is a great boon to democracy, and I feel that way about all social media. I feel that way in Europe as well. I think that we have lost control of social media, and people aren't held responsible enough for the things that get amplified, especially hate speech that gets amplified on social media. But I think that's true of a lot of social media, and I always thought that social media was going to connect us. It was going to unify us as a world. This was 10, 15 years ago. But now I see some of the effect that social media has had, whether it's kids in high school or it's politics around the world. I think on balance, social media has not been a boon. I thought it was going to help the Arab Spring and you'd have democracy all over the Middle East. Instead, I don't think it's been a great boon to democracy.
You write a lot in your book about Musk's war on woke and how that originated. Tell us a little bit about that and how important that is for his view of the world.
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk was originally a centrist, generally a Democrat, raised money for Obama, donated to Obama, supported Biden. So that happened. About 3 years ago, he started shifting to the right. Many reasons for it. He had been attacked by a lot of Democrats, and even though he had paid more taxes than any person in history to any country, he was attacked for shirking his taxes. That got his back up. Secondly, he didn't like regulations and restrictions that came down after COVID. He understood the need for some of it, but the absolute lockdowns, he felt, went overboard. You can disagree with that, but that helped push him. Then he had his first child named Xavier after the X-Men comics, who transitioned and became his daughter. And he got his head around that, but she also became very much of a Marxist, decrying him, denouncing her father, saying she hated all people of wealth. And he thought that she had gotten indoctrinated at high school by this woke mind virus. So all of these things and many others contribute to what I think has been a shift at times to the populist right. But let me add, I said there are many personalities of Elon Musk. This week he's meeting with Democrats in Washington. There are times he talks very moderately about how we need more centrist candidates, how he's going to do a PAC for people who are in the center. So I think he fluctuates. He's mercurial on his politics like everything else. And yes, I think there's been times when he's gotten darkly putting his thumb on the scale as he moved to the populist, sometimes amplifying people on the fringe of the right.
When you spent time with him, and you spent many hours with him, did you know which Elon Musk, which personality you were going to get at any moment?
Oh, yeah, well, you certainly knew which personality you were with at any moment, but they would shift suddenly. And I remember Claire Boucher Grimes saying to me one night when there were a group of people around, whispering to me, he's about to go into demon mode. And she could tell, storm clouds gathering, his eyes become vacant, he becomes very silent. So you could watch the mood shift. Most of the time he was in what I would call engineering mode, in which he would just focus serially, not at the same time, focus on a valve, then focus on video uplink to Twitter, and then focus on a car battery cell problem. And in engineering mode, he would just be intensely focused on the physics and material properties of an engineering problem at hand.
There's a word that crops up in your book quite a lot, which I can't repeat on terrestrial television, but it starts with an A and ends with an E. Did he come across like that to you?
Well, there were many times, especially in demon mode, where he was a jerk, or to use the technical term that begins with A, I say it in the book. He was that way at times, and he doesn't have a natural empathy sometimes for the people in front of him. There are other times where he's both giddy and funny and inspiring, rallying the troops, saying how important it is, their mission. So there were so many times I watched him turn on people at a meeting, or walking late one night, a Friday night at 10 p.m., in this tiny town in the south tip of Texas where he's got his rocket launch pad. And suddenly he's angered by the fact that there are only 2 people working on the launch pad, even though it's 10 o'clock on a Friday night. And he just reams out this guy who's a really nice guy named Andy. And later I follow up. I ask him, why'd you do that to Andy? He almost had no memory of it. And months later I follow up with Andy. He said, well, I learned from it and I believe in the mission and it pushed me. So sometimes he pushes people and drives them mad, drives them to distraction. But he also sometimes drives them to do things they didn't know they would be able to do. Sometimes they leave because he is such a word that begins with A.
Okay, we'll have everyone guessing. Final question, Walter. I mean, is there a danger for Musk that he has reached peak Musk? He's got so many companies, so many interests at the moment. Is it possible that he might succumb to an unscheduled rapid disassembly, as someone once said about one of his rockets?
That's what they call the rocket launches. You know, every time he does something, especially when he took over Twitter, and then with his bare hands and pliers he got from Home Depot, ripped out some of the servers in Sacramento on Christmas Eve, sort of in a total crazed and manic mode. I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to wake up in the morning and Twitter's not going to exist. Or I'm going to wake up in the morning and, you know, something's going to happen to all of Starlink. But then, even after that, he decides to start another company. He calls me up and says, you got to come back to Austin. And he tells me he's starting an artificial intelligence company. And I'm thinking, how can you run all of these things? So yeah, I think at a certain point, some of these things may blow up. But that's how he's gotten where he is. He blew up his first 3 rockets he ever launched. You know, a lot of bad things happened on the way, but he's willing to take those risks. And yeah, there's going to be some explosions. But I think he feels that unless you're willing to blow things up, you're not going to be willing to get things done.
Walter Isaacson, thank you very much.
Thank you.